Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. You're watching Newsroom. I'm your host for today, Fahim Bangash. Well, viewers, we live in a world where dynamics are changing every day, where socio-political situations are changing every day, where overall circumstances in different countries are changing on an everyday basis. As they say, change is a constant, but this is not a good change that we are talking about, because we are looking forward to a world that is not very healthy. Well, that's exactly what we're going to be talking about in the main two segments of today. First of all, we will be talking about the situation in Palestine, what is going on, as we know that over 28,600 Palestinians have been killed so far, as today is the 132nd day of the Israeli offensive. 68,395 people have been wounded, and just in the past 24 hours, we've seen 87 Palestinians who've been killed and 104 people who have been wounded. And we know of a hospital, the Nasser hospital, that has been besieged by the Israeli forces. We will be talking in detail, in depth about that with our esteemed panel members. And in our second segment, we shall be talking about India. Well, there is a march going on in India. There is the farmers' protest going on in India, and they need their rights to be fulfilled. They need their rights by the government to be fulfilled as soon as possible. What are the dynamics in India? We will be talking about that, because there are thousands of Indian farmers which are looking forward to this and marching towards Delhi, calling it the Dilli Chalo March. And besides that, there has been an eruption of a scuffle between the police and the people. There have been tear gas shells, and the police has ordered 30,000 tear gas shells to prevent that march, to prevent the farmers from entering Delhi. This is going to be our second segment. And in the third segment, we will be talking about general stories, news stories from around the world. First of all, we will be talking about the Amazon rainforest, as they call it, lungs of the world. We know that that rainforest is getting badly affected due to the climate change which is going on in the world, and definitely it's on the brink of collapsing, I would say, because naturally global warming is not just affecting this part of the world, it's affecting that part of the world where the Amazon rainforest is present, that is South America continent. And we see the warming temperatures and the sapping of moisture from that region could lead to a lot of wildfires, could lead to an end of an ecosystem which has been there since centuries, which has been there fostering the growth of many species, thousands of species over there, and that is in a lot of danger. Then we will be talking about our last story for today, and that's going to be the death anniversary, the 155th death anniversary of the legendary poet Mirzaghalib today. Obviously, we know he was born on 27th of December 1797, and one of the most read poets of this region, not just Pakistan and India, but the entire region. His work has been translated into many languages, and he has a very amazing command as far as linguistics is concerned, as far as usage of language is concerned, as far as emotions are concerned. We will be talking about that. And now let's kickstart our conversation in the first segment of the program. But before we do that, I would like to introduce our guests for the first segment. First of all, we have in the studio Mr. Jauhar Saleem. He's former Foreign Secretary. Jauhar Saleem, sir, welcome to our program. And on the telephone line, we will be having Ms. Maleeha Lodhi. She is a former ambassador of Pakistan to the UN. Ms. Maleeha Lodhi, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to our program.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Lovely to have you, ma'am. Now, obviously, this is the 132nd day that we're talking about the Israeli offensive. It's going on, and now we are seeing that the evacuation has gone on to, the end of the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip itself is a very small area, as we all know. Ever since the 7th of October, we've seen people describing on different maps, overall, verbally, what the Gaza Strip is all about. And now we know that this is right beside Egypt. And even We see that heavily guarded by the Israeli troops. We see that people are trying to exit, but then again, there is indiscriminate firing by the Israeli troops. There is bombing, there is shelling, there is firing. And not to forget, there are a lot of women and children who are suffering in that region. Definitely, that needs a lot of discussion, that needs a lot of sensitization, I would say. So the recent development is basically that Rafah crossing, Israel has vowed that it will bomb, that it will have a ground offensive on the Rafah crossing. And on the other hand, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, they have warned of catastrophic results. So coming to you, Jauhar Saleem sir, these three countries, namely Australia, Canada, New Zealand, right? At first, maybe people thought that, okay, Hamas attacked first, maybe this is going to be some damage, but now we see this has gone out of hands. So even countries from the Western world, they are coming forward and they're trying to warn Israel of the catastrophic consequences that this might be having. So what's your take on that?
Well, firstly, I think since the inception of this very unfortunate, tragic crisis, military action by the Israelis, which has led to the deaths of over 28,000 Palestinians so far, and a big number of women and children. I have been saying that, unfortunately, it would be a massacre because it involves the political survival of perhaps the biggest politician Israel has produced, Netanyahu, who is credited with having 9 lives. He's a great survivor. And this time, just even before the crisis of, before our October 7th events, he had been in deep trouble domestically because of the way he wanted to manipulate the Israeli superior courts. And on top of that, when this happened, and the perception of the so-called invincible Netanyahu, who could ensure security for the Israelis, that myth was broken. So then Netanyahu, what he did, he set up what he called a war cabinet. And then he went about this invasion and this military action, which was totally indiscriminate, ruthless, and perhaps one of the worst that the world has seen in recent times or decades. The Western pressure, in the beginning, of course, the Western support was for, unconditionally for Israel because of the October 7th events. But gradually, as the death toll started mounting on the other side, and as the media images of the actions, the indiscriminate bombing, the killings, the starving, of the misery of the Palestinians became more and more evident, the world opinion started shifting. We saw, first of all, it was countries like China, Russia, Muslim countries, countries which are more neutral in their approach, but gradually it was the Western countries as well, where we started having more and more noises. There were huge demonstrations, as we recall, in cities like London and Paris and all that. But now even that has been happening for quite some time. And then the matter was, of course, taken to the United Nations Security Council, to the GA. Many times there were the multiple attempts for resolutions for a ceasefire, but all the attempts faltered in the face of the US vetoes or very resolute defiance by Israel. At the same time, subsequently the South Africans took Israel to ICJ. Now that was a momentous action because it's happened one of very few times in the modern history that such an action has been taken. And there was actually a ruling by the ICJ where they asked Israel to take all possible actions to stop the genocide, to prevent a genocide rather, and also take actions to resume the humanitarian assistance, which had been blocked by the Israelis, unfortunately, and which had caused great suffering on top of the killings that had been going on. But what we have seen is that unfortunately that ICJ ruling has not made a huge difference. And why is that? That is because first of all, the language was such that was unfortunately open to interpretation. And the Israelis have interpreted it in their way, saying that, okay, because we are not involved in a genocide, and we are taking a military action against terrorism, and we are taking all possible measures to ensure that the civilian casualties are minimum. So they have been able to somehow evade that ruling as well. Now we have come to a point where, because the military action started from the north, and it continued till this southerlymost point in Gaza Strip, which is Rafah. Before that, it was Khan Yunis, the big city. Now, Rafah was a city of just 280,000 people. But right now, it has swelled 5 times because everybody in Gaza Strip has come to this, because there's nowhere else to go. So all those Palestinians which were being bombed, which was starving, which were wounded without any medical aid, they'd come to this. About 1.4 million people are here now. Now the point is, what are the Israelis going to do from here on? Of course, the airstrikes are, as we talk, the airstrikes are in process, and limited ground invasion by the special forces, for instance, in this Nasser hospital in Khan Yunis has just taken place. What I see in the media is that now even the Israeli army, the Israeli generals are actually asking Netanyahu not to go for a ground operation in Rafah, because they say even that would be catastrophic, not just for the population there, but also for the Israeli army, because now Israelis, they claim that the hostages are still there. They claim that thousands of, and they do claim that they have killed 8,000 or 9,000, whatever numbers of Hamas soldiers. That's their claim. And they claim the rest are now there. They're mixed with the civilian population in Rafah. And of course, the tunnel network, that there's a huge tunnel network. The Israelis claim about 1,200 kilometers or more, which houses the command and control center and perhaps the leaders of Hamas, as per the Israelis. I think this is a critical point now. Now, the world pressure has to start counting from here on, because otherwise we could see the number of casualties just multiplying by many, many times.
So we will come back to this. Obviously, this is a very important point that you raised. And another very important thing that you very rightly said, that according to Israeli media, it says that the decision, the ruling which was given by the ICJ, this is subject to interpretation. Now, Ms. Maleeha, you have been a part of the United Nations yourself. And United Nations has been urging the Israeli authorities to perhaps look into it, to perhaps go for a ceasefire, to perhaps lessen the effects, the catastrophic effects that it has been having in the local population, in the civilian fraternity especially. How do you see this going on, ma'am? And especially the ruling of the ICJ, we see that Israel does not seem to be paying any heed to that. And we see that it's acting as if it's independent of every kind of law, every kind of ruling, every kind of decision or a verdict. What's your take on that?
Well, I think first we have to see what is happening in Rafah, the tragedy and the bloodshed that's already going on against the backdrop of 4 months of Israel's war on Gaza, 4 months of killings, destruction, ethnic cleansing, war crimes, and genocide. 28,000 people dead, killed by Israel, more than half being children. This is the backdrop. So it's no surprise that Israel is continuing its rampage and its war crimes, taking them into Rafah, which is the last sort of place for refuge for the Palestinian people. Almost over a million Palestinians are in fact seeking refuge in very cramped conditions in Rafah. And yet Israel has carried out airstrikes. It's now threatening to do a ground offensive. So the question you ask is, well, the UN, the UN Secretary General and many UN officials, including UN rapporteurs on human rights and on other issues, have called for a humanitarian ceasefire, but this hasn't taken place. And why hasn't this taken place? There is one country that is standing in the way, and that country is the United States. sadly, even now, Algeria, which is a member at the moment, a non-permanent member of the Security Council, has put forward a draft resolution to the Security Council asking for a humanitarian ceasefire and actually arguing that the ICJ, the World Court orders, cannot be implemented in Gaza unless there is a ceasefire. And again, it is the U.S. ambassador, on behalf, of course, of a country, who is opposing this resolution, this draft resolution. So, the only country that Israel listens to is, of course, the United States of America. And what is the U.S., what has the Biden administration done? Nothing. They have pretended that they care for civilian casualties, but in actual fact, in reality, they've been arming the Israelis to the teeth, and they have stood in the way of several ceasefire resolutions in the Security Council. Look, it is, after all, the UN Security Council which has the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. So its inability to perform that function is really due to vetoes exercised by the United States and its opposition to resolutions calling for a ceasefire. Now, as you know, South Africa has approached the World Court, the ICJ, asking for additional emergency measures in the wake of Israel's plan to launch this ground offensive in Rafah. And as you would recall, the Israeli government was given by the ICJ until 23rd of February, a month from their verdict, to report to the ICJ on what it has done to comply with the 6 orders the court had issued, including the one relating to preventing genocide, preventing the killing of Palestinians, as well as protecting Palestinian lives. Now, what we have seen is Israel defy with impunity all these orders, and now increasingly international opinion, because as Jauhar had rightly said, international opinion, particularly Western opinion, because the rest of the world was already calling for a ceasefire. But now we have seen Western powers also shift course and urge Israel to not carry out a ground offensive in Rafah because they know that this will have catastrophic consequences.
Also, Maleeha,
so here's,
you very interestingly mentioned a point here. You mentioned the veto power. Do you not think that's the biggest loophole as far as the United Nations is concerned? Because I think that really, that's like the death of the purpose of the United Nations. You yourself mentioned that it was created for international peace and security. But this veto, that's basically the main hurdle in creating a peace in the entire world. Obviously, even if one country versus the whole world, and we see no action is being taken because of that particular veto. How do you think, do you see any future? Do you see any amendments in the future? Because this has been going on since quite a while.
No, I don't see any amendment at all, because the 5 permanent members of the Security Council who have the veto power are not about to give it up for anything. And that, of course, is not just the United States. It's Russia, China, the United Kingdom, France. All of them are very jealous and guard their veto power jealously. Now, it's a fact that there are 2 countries that have used this the most, the United States and Russia. And the U.S. has mostly been using it to protect Israel, to become sort of Israel's shield, as it were, to prevent Israel from actually carrying out what UN Security Council resolutions have been asking it to carry out, which is an end to the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. So, this is, yes, it's a reality that the veto is part of the structure of the world's premier diplomatic sort of body, if you like. This is the most important diplomatic forum in the world. But it was structured in such a way after the Second World War by the victors of the Second World War that it hasn't changed, because to change it will require a very cumbersome process of reform of the Security Council, for which majorities will be needed, and not just the General Assembly, but also it will require ratification and approval by the 5 permanent members who are not going to give up this power. So, but behind the veto, of course, is the positions that countries take. I mean, those are only reflected in the veto. So for the United States, whose foreign minister or secretary of state has been visiting Israel and Egypt and other neighboring countries, claiming that they want some kind of a truce and saying that there are talks that are going on with Hamas through the Egyptians and people from Qatar. That hasn't really come to anything yet, because the U.S. has failed to use its leverage with Israel. It's election year, as you know, in America. And also, I think, there are reports that President Biden is increasingly frustrated by Prime Minister Netanyahu. But, his frustration is of no use to anybody, frankly. If he can't act, and if he can't act as the president of the most powerful nation on earth, what's the point of being the most powerful nation on earth?
That's true. That's true. Now, Jauhar Saleem Saab, we know Saudi Arabia and the US, they have a very strong alliance, right? And Saudi Arabia has quite categorically mentioned to the US that it needs to have that 1967 resolution implemented with East Jerusalem as the capital, and a two-state solution, basically. That's what Saudi Arabia is looking forward to. And we know that US is equally linked with Israel as it is to Saudi Arabia. What position do you think the US is in right now? Because it is being pressured from both sides, an equal amount of pressure from Saudi Arabia and Israel. So how do you think the US is going to go in the future?
No, I see it very differently. I think the Saudi influence in the US and the Israeli influence in the US, they are totally not proportionate.
Mm-hmm.
Israeli influence in the US, it has a historical bipartisan presence, and in fact no US administration has ever been able to wean out of that influence. We would recall the times when President Obama, at one point, he was literally not on talking terms with Prime Minister Netanyahu, but still Prime Minister Netanyahu was invited to the US, and he was invited to address the Congress without the invitation of the President. So with Israelis, it's a totally. In fact, if you would recall, just before the October 7th events, the US was trying through the Abraham Accords, they were trying to make Israel acceptable and normalize its relations with the major countries in the Gulf, including countries such as Bahrain, Jordan, and then UAE, and Saudi Arabia, most important of all. And if 7th October would not have happened, that process had gone pretty advanced. But then the process stopped. So I think, first of all, we have to get out of this notion that there is any sort of equality.
Equality,
or any,
right?
Yeah, they're totally. There's no proportion at all in terms of the relative influence of the two in the U.S. Israeli influence in the U.S. And it's not just the Israeli influence in the U.S. By many American analysts, Israel is seen as an outpost of the U.S. power in the Middle East. So it's mutually important. And that is why I don't really see that, the Saudis have come up very categorically now.
Yeah.
But the best they can do is, and that's what they're saying. They're saying that we will not normalize unless you do this, right? But the Americans, right now, they're not going to do that, in the short term. I think that point would come in the medium term as to, the negotiations for sort of Saudi-Israeli normalization. But for the time being, what is important is what is happening in Rafah, like Dr. Maleeha said. And I think that's a critical point. What is more important right now is the negotiation, the back-channel diplomacy, or in fact the shuttle diplomacy that America is conducting with the Israelis on the one hand, and with some Arab countries, and indirectly with Hamas. Because Hamas's leadership is based, like Ismail Hania is based in Qatar. Other senior leadership is also based out of Gaza. So that negotiation is pretty advanced as well. In fact, the Hamas recently, Netanyahu said what Hamas has proposed, and Hamas had proposed a 3-stage, like 45 days, and 45 days, sort of, like humanitarian pause or ceasefire, whatever you might call it. But the Israelis, with certain conditions. The Israelis rejected that, and in fact, Netanyahu used the term that this is delusional on part of Hamas. But the very fact that negotiation is taking place, and the very fact that the US, which is a very important country, not just in the world, but also for Israelis, perhaps the most important, because all the money with which they are waging this war, a lot of that money is coming from the US as well. We have to remember that. So because the Americans are the facilitators of this diplomacy, so our biggest hope at this point in time could be that diplomacy succeeds to at least a point where there's a humanitarian pause, and the suffering of the people, of the Palestinians in Rafah, that abates, at least in the short term. And from there we'll see, the diplomacy would get a better chance. But I think that has to happen in the short term. And short of that, there is no other institution in the world, whether it's UN or ICJ or any other forums like OIC or any other country which can exert enough pressure on Israelis to stop.
Right. Also, sir, I think one last question with Ms. Maleeha I would like to ask. Ma'am, I did see a message, I did see a post on social media from one of the renowned channels calling the death of Palestinian miners. Are we trying to desensitize the world? Because obviously that's how human minds are made. You keep on hearing one thing and you kind of get used to it, and maybe this is how the media is trying to play with the minds of people, that okay, calling it Palestinian miners would have a lesser impact on people as compared to calling them children and women perhaps. So what do you think? Do we need to sensitize the media more? What should be the media strategy as far as promotion of negotiations are concerned, A? And B, what do you think now is the role of the United Nations in perhaps promoting and fostering and making a conducive atmosphere for the negotiations to take place?
Well, you said several things. Let me try to unpack those. First of all, the media, you say the media has desensitized. Well, let's be clear, it's the Western media. It's not the international media. The West is not the international community. I think if you look at the media of the global South, particularly in the Arab countries and Muslim countries, but also of other third world countries now called the global South. Nobody uses the word third world anymore. There, the media has been, been projecting the truth on the ground and what Israel has been doing, and its war crimes, and actually calling what Israel's actions amount to, which is a war crime. So let's be very clear. But it is true, as you said, the Western media has been using language as well as its entire coverage of the last 4 months of Israel's war on Gaza has been to try to desensitize exactly what you were talking about, the deaths, the killings, the plight of the Palestinian people. And I think that shameful record, sort of is matched by the record of some Western countries, which is equally shameful. I think both the Western media as well as some Western countries, I can't say all because some have taken, a different position, has really been shameful. They have allowed this genocide to continue for 4 months. And then, talk of diplomacy, frankly, 4 months of so many killings means the failure of diplomacy. How are these negotiations really proceeding? What's really happening? I mean, what kind of diplomacy is this? That every day, hundreds, if not more, men, women, and children are killed in cold blood. So this is the failure, monumental, epic failure of diplomacy. Now, the role of the United Nations is very clear, as I said before. It is the UN Security Council which is charged with the responsibility to end wars, to ensure that there are ceasefires, to prevent killing. But if it's not living up to that responsibility, the reason is, as I identified before, it is the United States. It's not the other countries of the Security Council. If you recall, all the other countries, with perhaps only one exception, the United Kingdom, which abstained on some resolutions, all the rest of the countries wanted a ceasefire. They still want a ceasefire, but the U.S. stands in the way. So the role of the United Nations is being blocked, undermined, by U.S. policy, which is entirely one-sided, and it's really blind to the suffering of the Palestinian people.
Right, Maleeha Sahiba, thank you very much for your time and your insight into the matter. It has been a pleasure talking to you. And right now, viewers, we will be taking a short break, after which I'm going to return with our second segment. And as I told you, we'll be talking about the protests in India. So do stay with us, don't go anywhere, and stay tuned. All right, welcome back to Newsroom. And as I told you earlier, that the second segment is going to be about India and what's happening in India. Dilli Chalo March by the Indian farmers. We did see this kind of a march 2 years before as well. And both of these marches have happened in the era of Modi. Now, we also know that the elections are coming in India and quite soon. I mean, and we also know that Prime Minister Modi is vying for a fourth term in the government, and but then obviously there are hurdles like this, and there are quite a lot of demands by the farmers, definitely, and they want their rights to be fulfilled. They want the minimum support price, they want the implementation of Swaminathan Commission report, they want the pensions for the farmers, they want the debt waivers, and many such demands which they are currently waiting for, and thousands of them are there because obviously it has become very difficult for them to make ends meet. Now, first of all, I'd introduce the guests for this segment. First of all, we have in the studio Jauhar Saleem Saab, who is here with us in the first segment as well. So we'll continue this discussion with you. Pleasure. And on the telephone line, we have Sardar Ramesh Singh Arora. He's a Sikh leader. Sir Arora Saab, welcome to PTV World in our program. Now, sir, I'll start off with you, Jauhar Saab. The demands of the Indian farmers, they had such demands in the past as well. We did see that happening 2 years ago as well. Now, do you see this as a failure on the part of Modi government, the Modi administration? Because we also see the sealing of all the borders of Delhi.
Yeah, I see it as indifference. I see it as a situation where Modi government feels that they can ignore the demands of the farmers, although this is such a huge chunk of Indian population. Like 1/5 of India's GDP is still linked to agriculture, and a big chunk of India's employment is linked to this sector. But despite that, of course, it doesn't produce as much as the industrial sector or the services sector. And Modi's focus has always been on the business, like on the industry, on the trading, on the services. That's how he built his political career. And he has persistently undermined the interests of the farmers. We saw 2 years back when in 2021, there was almost a year-long protest movement by the farmers. 600 farmers were killed during that movement.
Yes.
And then finally, some of their demands were met and a commission was established. But now what we see is, again, they're unhappy with the fact that some of the recommendations of the panels were not implemented. And then the new demands are primarily in 3 areas. One is they want a support price, a minimum support price.
Yes.
Now, there is actually a minimum support price in India for 20 agriculture products. But the problem is that the government actually only buys 2 of these, wheat and rice. So the rest of the 18 products, they don't. And why do they do that? Because there's a subsidy program in India which is valued at about $28.5 billion. And that program means free rice or wheat for a big segment of Indian population, or at least at very subsidized prices. And for that, they buy those 2 staples. But the other staples produced by the farmers, they are not, the state governments don't buy them. And that is where one of the biggest problems lie. The other thing is the agriculture credits. Now the interest rate is heavy, and sometimes when the crops fail, millions and millions of farmers, they are literally, they go bankrupt. There are thousands of suicides every year. And the government seems very indifferent, very insensitive to this situation. Because on the one hand, the farmers say that when the industry or the industrialists have similar problems, then tens of billions of dollars worth of, or thousands and or hundreds of thousands crores worth of loans are waived
off. Yes.
But for farmers, it's not done. So that is the other big problem for them. Then what they were trying to do, the deregulation of the farm sector, in terms of the sales in terms of the contract farming and all that. And then fourth is important again, the energy cost for them, because the farmers get subsidized energy, but now the Indian government is moving away from that, and that could be a big problem for them. So what I see is, now it's very interesting that while we see it happening in India, and it's happening in the agricultural states primarily, for example, Punjab, Haryana, Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, the farmers are all congregating and trying to go to the capital. This echoes with what we saw in Europe. You would recall that in many European countries, we saw the same thing. The farmers trying to march to the capitals for their demands, and the demands were similar. So in one way, the problem is structural. That is that the agriculture sector is being neglected by many developing or developed countries, and the agriculture sector is being, let's say, in some ways, it's being undermined in preference to other sectors, that is services sectors or the industrial sector, and that is why we see these problems happening in so many different countries. And I would say that the world prices of agricultural commodities, they haven't really risen to that degree as we've, so the same amount of labor when it goes into sort of, let's say services or industry, the productivity is much higher, the wages are much higher. In the agriculture sector, that is not happening. So that's a structural problem. But the other problem is that their power in the government structure is not there. For example, the Indian business has a lot of influence on Modi's party. We all know Ambani's, how powerful they are.
Right.
Or some other Indian businesses, and how much influence they wield because of the donations they give to the party, or because of many other, direct or indirect pressure that they can bear on the political parties. But the farmers do not have such lobbies. They have these organizations. Now, there's this Mazdoor Kisan Morcha, an organization of about 150, an umbrella organization of 150 organizations. And then there's another one which covers about 100. So there are these 250 associations which under these two umbrellas are now marching. But what we see is that instead of giving them this opportunity, because India is supposed to be a democracy, and in democracy you have to give people the right to assembly, the right to the freedom of expression. But the Indian government, what are they trying to do? They are trying to stop them by using illegal means. We've seen they're being tear gassed. We've seen rubber bullets are being used.
Yes.
We see that the roads are being blocked and all that. But I believe that eventually they'll have to come up with some sort of negotiations, and we might see a repeat of what happened in 2021, where eventually, but after a great deal of suffering and after a great deal of killings, unfortunately, some sort of a compromise was arrived at.
Right, and now moving on to Arora Saab. Sir, first of all, welcome. Second of all, we know that Modi is vying for a fourth term in the elections which are upcoming in India. We know that. Now, there seems to be a lot of pressure on Modi himself, because obviously we know everything that's been happening in India, especially the minorities. Modi particularly is not quite famous or quite popular with the minority groups, especially the Sikhs. Especially now we know what has happened in Canada. There is external pressure on Modi as well, from the US, from Canada, and definitely we know that there are some people mentioning the farmers as Khalistanis, or perhaps there is other point scoring as well, blame game going on. How do you see Modi's position and condition in the current circumstances?
Yeah, thank you very much. Almost 3 or 4 months back, you still remember I was on the media, not only me, the majority of the Sikh community from Pakistan and worldwide, the diaspora was on the media, and they were protesting slogans, particularly on the killing of Mr. Niger. And then there was another incident happened in America, so something like that. And every Sikh is crying that why the Sikhs living in India, not only in India, now the Sikhs living outside India, now why they are not safe. And whatever case you see, and if you analyze that case, you will find that there is India behind that killing or behind that mishandling. So that's why, if you see now what is happening in India, why the Sikhs are on the roads, and particularly the farmers are on the road. And Punjab is very much famous because Punjab is a food basket for the India, and Punjab is producing almost 70% of the production used by India is produced by the Punjab. And there was a year-long protest, particularly against the federal government, against the bill, against the laws they passed in the federal assembly, and then they repealed that law. But the thing is, there is a mindset in India, and that mindset is the minorities living in India, they consider themselves that they are not safe. And that mindset, there's a big question mark. India always claims that we are the one who are a secular state and we protect the rights of the minorities. But in actual, what happened with the Sikh community, if you go back in 1984, the Operation Blue Star and then the Sikh killing in Delhi, so there was Sikh genocide, and still the Sikh community is struggling to get the justice. And unfortunately, the government of India, whosoever was in the government, either it's Congress, either it's the BJP, they didn't give justice to the Sikh community, not only the government, the judiciary, they were unable to give justice, and still those who are behind this massacre, who are behind this Sikh genocide, they're still not in the court of law, and they are moving freely in India, and Sikh, they are still struggling to get the justice. And that's why, if you talk about particularly the Kashmir, the Muslims living in India, they are still struggling, or whatever has happened in the Kashmir, it's in anyone, and it's in front of everyone, and particularly if you talk about the Dalits and then other minorities, and the Christians, you will find that every minority living in India, they are in a very, you can say, in a situation, vulnerable situation, that they don't enjoy their basic rights. So now India need to think about not only the India, the international community, they must need to think about it, and particularly the United Nations, who always talk about that there must be a human rights. But unfortunately, if there is a human rights violation in India, they should come forward and they should play the role. And now if the farmers are on the road and they are struggling for their rights, they need to understand why they are on the road. Because they are not getting the proper price of the product, they are not getting proper seed, they are not getting proper, you can say, whatever the law was passed and whatever they has promised with the farmers. So if they are not giving proper rights, so certainly they will be on the road. So Indian government, they must need to understand that Modi, who claims that I am the one who look after every minority, but in reality, they don't do it.
Right, and also, Sir, Modi we have seen in the past as well, and now especially not very popular with the minorities, like I already said. But now, since the elections are coming closer and nearby, we see that he is trying to develop more close connections as far as minorities are concerned. For example, building a temple with the UAE, getting closer with the UAE, right? And building his popularity more among the Hindu community by building that Ayodhya temple and then the Ayodhya mosque for the Muslims. So perhaps he's trying to build that soft corner for himself with the minority communities. But then, like Mr. Arora was mentioning, that perhaps he will never be popular with the Sikh community for whatever has been happening within India and outside India. What's your take, sir?
Actually, I would argue slightly differently. Because you see these steps, for instance, like building this mandir on the site of Yoda, of course, where Babri Mosque used to be number one, and then this temple in UAE. I think that is to burnish or embellish his credentials as the protector and promoter of Hinduism in the world. Now that has been his plank, and Modi has felt that
that's a way of looking at it. Yes,
exactly.
Yes.
He has always felt that if I have a solid chunk of vote of sort of this mainstream Hindu belt, then I don't need any votes of minorities. That has been his sort of politics so far, and it has worked for him because this vote is enough because Hindus are in majority in India, and he has been able to galvanize the Hindus. He has become the champion of Hindutva, and in fact this temple that has been built in UAE, this is symbolic because this shows that he is now bringing Hinduism out of India onto the world stage. On the one hand, and within India is showing that okay, I can look, the mosque has been raised and a temple in its place has been built. So basically he is pandering to the Hindu votes, and I think he's ignoring the farmers, which has been rightly pointed out, which include many of India's minorities, also shows that he can ignore them with impunity. Why? Because for him their votes are not important. For him the Hindu vote is important.
So that's a very interesting and important point that you raised, but I'm sorry we're a bit pressed for time. So thank you very much for being here, and Arora Saab, thank you very much for your time and for being here and giving us your insight into the matter. And as I told you earlier, we have two interesting news stories today, and like I was telling you, the lungs of the world, the Amazon rainforest, is of course having a very devastating effect by the climate change which is ongoing in the world, and not just affecting the global south. It's started to affect the global north as well, but we're talking about the Amazon rainforest. Amazon rainforest has now droughts, it has heat waves, it's sapping the area of the moisture that it once used to have, because rainforests are the areas where it's always raining, it's always humid, and that's how the ecosystem over there thrives. And basically the researchers have estimated that 10 to 47% of Amazon's current forest cover will face the combined stresses by 2050. And the other news story that we were talking about today happens to be the 155th death anniversary of legendary poet Mirzaghalib, and that's being observed today. Even today, he's still the most popular poet, and we see, for example, like he said, "Na tha kuch to khuda tha, kuch na hota to khuda hota, duboya mujhko hone ne, na hota main to kya hota." We see a lot of emotions embedded into his poetry. We see beautiful use of language in his poetry, and his best poems, they were written in three forms: ghazal, masnavi, or qasida. And definitely he's one poet that needs to be remembered, that needs to be revered, and that, loads and loads more programs should be held to remember this great poet. Well, viewers, thank you very much for joining us in today's newsroom. I hope you will stay tuned to PTV World, and we'll see you inshallah very soon. Take care till then. Allah Hafiz.